This multimillionaire invited a black security guard and her son to his party for fun. But when she touched the piano, something incredible happened. Ethan Wallace stood at the grand window of his penthouse, staring out at the twinkling cityscape below. The glittering lights of the metropolis stretched far into the distance, but instead of filling him with awe, they only deepened the growing sense of emptiness he had been feeling. At 42, Ethan had it all: wealth, influence, and success. As the owner of a multi-million-dollar tech company, his name was well known among the elite. Yet, despite all the accolades, there was something hollow about it all. His lavish life, filled with parties, luxury, and power, had become nothing more than a repetitive cycle of empty interactions. Tonight, he was supposed to finalize the guest list for his upcoming charity gala, a high society event that promised to bring in the city's most powerful and influential people. It was a tradition by now: throw a party, raise money for a good cause, and enjoy the praise that came with it. But as Ethan stared at the list of names, each one carefully selected for their status, wealth, and connections, he felt a feeling of boredom wash over him. Same faces, same conversations. He muttered under his breath, tossing the list onto his desk. Suddenly, a spark of an idea hit him. Something different, something unexpected. Ethan had always prided himself on doing things out of the ordinary. This time, he decided he would invite someone completely outside his usual circle, someone who would never expect to be at such a grand event. His mind drifted to the woman he saw every morning when he arrived at his office building, Tessa Johnson, the black security guard who worked the day shift. Tessa was always there, dressed in her uniform, greeting him with a polite nod as she held the door for him and the other corporate giants who worked in the same building. Tessa seemed like a good choice, an ordinary woman from a completely different world. Ethan smirked to himself, imagining the look on his guests' faces when they saw her at the party. It would certainly shake things up, and that amused him. The next morning, Ethan found himself entering his office building just as he had every day. Tessa stood at her usual post, her sharp eyes scanning the lobby. When she saw him approach, she offered her customary smile and nod. "Good morning, Mr. Wallace," Tessa greeted him. "Good morning, Tessa," Ethan replied, slowing his pace as he approached her. Normally, he would rush past, but today he stopped, something new on his mind. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice casual, "about my charity gala this weekend." Tessa raised an eyebrow, curious but unsure why he was telling her this. "Oh?" she said, politely waiting for him to continue. "Yes," Ethan said with a light tone. "It's a pretty big event, a lot of important people and, well, I was wondering if you and your son might want to attend." Tessa blinked, momentarily shocked by his words. "Me? And my son?" she repeated, as if she hadn't heard him correctly. Ethan smiled, nodding. "Yes, I think it would be great to have some fresh faces there. It's all very, predictable usually. Plus, I hear your son is into music. There's going to be a grand piano there. I'm sure he'd love to see it up close." Tessa's heart skipped a beat. Her son Daniel was indeed an aspiring musician, and though he had never played on anything more than the old piano at their church, the thought of him being near a grand piano was almost too much to hope for. But she hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of joke. She and Daniel didn't belong in the world of multimillionaires. What could she possibly bring to an event like that? "That's very generous of you, Mr. Wallace," she said slowly, her mind racing. "But I don't think we'd fit in at a place like that." Ethan waved her concern away with a flick of his hand. "Nonsense, it's just a party, Tessa. You and Daniel are more than welcome. Consider it my treat. You can dress up, enjoy the evening, and have a bit of fun. What do you say?" Tessa hesitated again, but deep down, she knew how much it would mean to Daniel to be in a room with that kind of music. "Well," she finally said, nodding slightly. "If you're sure, then thank you. I think we'd like that." "Great," Ethan said with a grin. "I'll have an invitation sent to you today. It's this Saturday at 7 p.m. Don't worry about a thing. Just show up and enjoy yourselves." Tessa watched as Ethan went towards the elevator, still processing what had just happened. She couldn't believe it. A charity gala at a multi-millionaire's mansion with her and her son as guests. Part of her still wondered if she'd be out of place, but another part, perhaps the stronger part, was excited at the thought of giving Daniel this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Later that day, as Tessa arrived home, she found Daniel already at the piano, practicing a piece he had been working on for weeks. The sound of his playing filled the small apartment, and despite the tiredness in her bones, Tessa smiled as she watched her son. Music was his passion, and seeing him pour his heart into the keys always brought her joy. "Mom?" Daniel said, glancing up when she entered. "Did you hear that? I almost got the whole thing right this time." "You're getting better every day," Tessa said, kissing him on the forehead. "You're going to be great." She paused, debating how to bring up the surprise. "Daniel," she began, "you're not going to believe this, but we've been invited to a party. A big one." Daniel looked at her, puzzled. "A party?" "Yes," Tessa replied, nodding. "Ethan Wallace, you know, the man who owns the building where I work, he invited us to his charity gala, and there's going to be a grand piano there." Daniel's eyes lit up. "A grand piano? Are you serious?" Tessa smiled at his excitement. "I am. We're going this Saturday." As Daniel's face broke into a wide grin, Tessa couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement too. Maybe this party wouldn't be so bad after all. It could be a chance for them to experience something new, something different. But in the back of her mind, she still wondered how they would be received in a world that had never been open to them before. Saturday evening arrived, and the excitement in Daniel's voice had been growing since morning. He had never been to anything like this before, a glamorous charity gala filled with important people, and more importantly, the chance to see a real grand piano. Tessa, however, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had crept in over the past few days. She had tried on multiple outfits, finally settling on a simple black dress that was elegant but understated. She didn't own anything fancy, and the idea of walking into a multi-millionaire's party in a thrift store dress felt like a recipe for humiliation. Still, she kept her worries to herself. Daniel's enthusiasm was contagious, and she didn't want to spoil his excitement. He had dressed in his best, in an old but neatly pressed suit that had been a gift from their pastor for his piano recitals at the church. It was slightly too big for him, but he carried himself with such confidence that it hardly mattered. "Mom, do you think they'll really let me play the piano?" Daniel asked, his eyes bright as they rode in the cab toward Ethan Wallace's estate. Tessa smiled at him in the rearview mirror, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Maybe if we're lucky," she said. "But even if you don't get to play, just seeing it will be exciting, right?" Daniel nodded, looking out the window as the lights of the city began to fade into the distance, replaced by the towering mansions of the elite. As they pulled up to Ethan's estate, Tessa's stomach tightened. The house was massive, far bigger than she had imagined. It loomed over them, surrounded by well-kept gardens and a driveway filled with luxury cars. She had never seen anything like it. The cab came to a stop, and Tessa took a deep breath, steadying herself before stepping out. Daniel, as always, seemed unbothered by the grandeur, his attention focused on the house and the piano waiting inside. As they walked up the driveway, Tessa could feel the stares of the guests who were already at the entrance. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering designer gowns glanced in their direction, some with thinly veiled curiosity, others with open disapproval. "They don't belong here," their eyes seemed to say. Tessa kept her head high, determined to ignore the judgmental glances, but she couldn't help the wave of discomfort that washed over her. She had known it would be like this. She and Daniel were outsiders in this world. No amount of confidence could change that. But she reminded herself why she had come, for Daniel's sake. He had never asked for anything beyond the opportunity to learn music, and if this night could give him a glimpse into the life he dreamed of, then it was worth every uneasy glance. As they reached the grand entrance, Ethan Wallace appeared, greeting guests with his usual charm. When he spotted Tessa and Daniel, his face lit up, and he moved toward them with a broad smile. "Tessa, Daniel, I'm so glad you could make it," Ethan said, extending his hand to both of them. "You look wonderful." "Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Wallace," Tessa said, trying to match his warmth despite her growing discomfort. "This place is incredible." Ethan grinned. "It's just a house. Please call me Ethan." And don't worry about anything tonight, just have fun." Daniel's eyes were wide open as he looked around the room. The vaulted ceilings, the shimmering chandeliers, the elegant decor. It was like stepping into another world. But his gaze kept drifting toward the grand piano in the center of the room, its polished surface gleaming under the soft lighting. "That's it, Mom," he whispered, tugging at her arm. "That's the piano." Tessa smiled at his excitement but gently squeezed his hand. "I know, sweetheart. But remember, we're just here to enjoy the party. Maybe later you can get a closer look." Ethan noticed the exchange and followed Daniel's gaze to the piano. "Ah, yes, the Steinway," he said. "It's quite a beauty, isn't it? Feel free to take a look, Daniel. Maybe even play a few notes if you'd like." Daniel's face lit up, but Tessa quickly interjected, shaking her head. "Oh no, Mr. Wallace, we couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," Ethan interrupted, waving off her concern. "What's the point of having a piano if no one plays it? I'd love to hear Daniel play." Tessa hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The thought of Daniel sitting down at that grand piano, in front of all these people, made her stomach turn. They were already being watched with suspicion, and the last thing she wanted was for Daniel to make a mistake and embarrass himself. But Daniel was practically vibrating with excitement, his eyes pleading with her for permission. Before she could answer, a tall, elegant woman with sharp features and a gown that shimmered like liquid gold approached them, her eyes cold and assessing. Tessa instantly recognized her as one of the socialites often featured in the society columns, someone who lived and breathed this world. "Ethan," the woman said smoothly, her eyes never leaving Tessa and Daniel. "Who are your guests?" Ethan turned to the woman with a polite smile, but Tessa could feel the undercurrent of judgment in her tone. "These are my friends," Ethan said easily. "Tessa and her son, Daniel. They're here to enjoy the evening with us." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How lovely," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "A bit unexpected, don't you think?" Tessa's cheeks burned, and for a moment she wanted nothing more than to grab Daniel's hand and flee. But before she could, Ethan gave the woman a pointed look. "Not everything has to be predictable, Claudia. Besides, I think Daniel's about to show us something special." Claudia arched an eyebrow, but said nothing more as she drifted back into the crowd. Ethan turned to Daniel, his smile encouraging. "Go on, Daniel. I know you've got something to show us." Tessa's heart pounded as she watched her son walk toward the piano. Every eye in the room seemed to follow him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She bit her lip, silently praying that everything would go smoothly. As Daniel sat at the piano, his fingers hovered above the keys for a moment, trembling with excitement and nerves. He glanced back at his mother, who nodded with a reassuring smile. Then he began to play. The first few notes filled the room, soft and tentative. But as Daniel found his rhythm, the melody began to swell, flowing through the space with a beauty that silenced the chatter of the guests. Tessa watched in awe as her son's fingers danced across the keys, his face focused and serious. It was as if the piano was an extension of him, the music pouring out effortlessly. Ethan stood nearby, a look of surprise and admiration on his face. The crowd, which had been full of doubt moments before, now watched in stunned silence, their expressions slowly changing from skepticism to awe. Tessa's heart swelled with pride, but there was also a nervous knot in her stomach. She hadn't expected this. And as the night continued, she had no idea that it would be her turn next to surprise everyone. As Daniel continued playing, the room seemed to fall under a spell. The once judgmental, skeptical faces softened, and the chatter of the crowd had long since quieted. Each note that flowed from the grand piano felt like a revelation, an unexpected burst of talent from a boy they had initially dismissed as out of place. Tessa stood off to the side, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her son pour his soul into the music. It wasn't just about playing the piano for Daniel. It was about expressing something deeper, something pure. Ethan, who had been watching with mild amusement at first, now found himself leaning forward, captivated by the skill and passion emanating from the young boy. He had invited Tessa and Daniel to this event as a whimsical, out-of-the-box gesture, never expecting that they would become the center of attention for something as profound as this. But as Daniel's playing intensified, Ethan realized this was no simple performance. There was genuine talent here, raw, unpolished, but unmistakable. The final note of the piece lingered in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the room erupted into applause. The guests who had been so dismissive earlier were now on their feet, clapping and cheering for the boy who had just stunned them all. Daniel's face flushed with a mixture of pride and relief as he stood up from the piano, glancing shyly at the crowd. His eyes searched for his mother, and when he found her, Tessa was already moving toward him, her own eyes brimming with tears. "You were amazing," Tessa whispered as she pulled him into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you." Daniel beamed, but before he could respond, Ethan approached them, clapping his hands and grinning broadly. "That was incredible, Daniel," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "I had no idea you could play like that." "Thank you, Mr. Wallace," Daniel said, his voice still shaking from the excitement. "You know," Ethan continued, looking around at the crowd of impressed guests, "you could easily have a future in music if that's what you want. Have you thought about taking your talent further?" Daniel nodded eagerly. "I want to study music full-time," he said. "One day, I want to be a professional pianist." Tessa's heart swelled with pride once again, but there was also a feeling of sadness. She knew how much Daniel dreamed of pursuing music, but their financial situation had never allowed them to even consider something like that. The cost of professional lessons, the expensive instruments, the travel, it all seemed so out of reach. And as much as she wanted to give Daniel everything, reality had always held them back. Ethan seemed to sense her unspoken thoughts. He smiled kindly at Tessa before turning his attention back to Daniel. "Well, you've certainly impressed a lot of important people tonight," he said with a chuckle. "I'm sure some of them might be able to help make those dreams come true." The applause from the crowd had died down, and the party slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Guests resumed their conversations, though many continued to cast curious glances in Daniel's direction, clearly still in awe of his performance. Ethan gestured toward a few well-dressed individuals nearby, subtly encouraging Daniel to mingle and bask in the attention his talent had earned. But as Daniel hesitated, clearly unsure of how to navigate this unfamiliar world, Tessa placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she whispered. "Enjoy this moment. You deserve it." With a grateful smile, Daniel nodded and moved toward the small group, who eagerly welcomed him into their conversation. Tessa watched him go, her heart aching with a bittersweet mixture of pride and longing. She had always known how gifted Daniel was, but seeing him in this environment, surrounded by people who could actually help him achieve his dreams, was both thrilling and overwhelming. Ethan, sensing her emotions, turned to her with a knowing smile. "You must be very proud of him," he said softly. "I am," Tessa replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He's always been talented, but opportunities like this don't come around for people like us." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the unspoken weight in her words. "People like you?" Tessa hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to reveal. But something about Ethan's demeanor made her feel comfortable enough to share the truth. "We don't have much, Mr. Wallace," she admitted. "I work hard, but money's always tight. Daniel's never had professional lessons or played on a piano like this before. He's taught himself everything he knows. I do what I can, but dreams like his are expensive." Ethan's expression softened as he listened to her words. He had spent most of his life surrounded by wealth and privilege, never really understanding the struggles of people like Tessa. But hearing her speak, seeing the love and sacrifice she had made for her son, gave him a new perspective. It wasn't just about talent, it was about the opportunities that were often out of reach for people like Tessa and Daniel. Suddenly, one of the guests, an older gentleman with a distinguished air, approached Ethan and Tessa. His eyes were fixed on Tessa, though his tone remained polite. "That was quite a performance from your son," the man said, nodding toward Daniel, who was still deep in conversation with the group. "You must be very proud." "I am," Tessa replied, offering a small smile. "He's worked hard for this." The man studied her for a moment before glancing at Ethan. "And what about you, Ms. Johnson?" Tessa supplied, feeling a bit uneasy under the man's scrutinizing gaze. "Ms. Johnson, have you ever considered playing yourself?" he asked, his tone casual but with a hint of curiosity. Tessa blinked in surprise. "Me? Oh no, I haven't played in years. I'm no pianist." Ethan tilted his head slightly, intrigued by the man's question. "You used to play?" Tessa shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, a long time ago, just for fun, nothing serious." The older man raised an eyebrow. "I find that hard to believe considering your son's talent. Surely he didn't learn it all on his own." Before Tessa could respond, Ethan gently nudged her. "Come on, Tessa," he said, his voice playful. "Let's hear what you've got. It's not every day we get to witness hidden talent." Tessa's heart raced, the thought of playing in front of these people making her palms sweat. But as she glanced over at Daniel, still basking in the glow of his own performance, she felt a surge of courage. Maybe it was time to show a piece of herself that she had kept hidden for so long. Taking a deep breath, Tessa moved toward the piano. The room grew quiet again as she sat down, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered above the keys. It had been years since she had played, and she wasn't sure if she still had it in her. But as soon as her fingers touched the ivory keys, a familiar melody began to flow from the piano, smooth and beautiful. And in that moment, the room was hers. As Tessa's fingers danced across the piano keys, the melody filled the room, rich and soulful. It was a piece she hadn't played in years, but muscle memory took over, and soon it felt as natural as breathing. The once judgmental crowd was now completely silent, their eyes fixed on her. Even Daniel, who had been the star of the night just moments before, stood off to the side, watching in awe. He had known his mother could play, but he had never heard her like this, so raw, so full of emotion. Ethan was stunned. He had expected something simple, a brief glimpse of a hidden hobby. But this was extraordinary. Tessa wasn't just a casual pianist. She played with the depth and skill of someone who had trained professionally, someone who had a profound connection to the music. It was as if she had been born to play. He could feel the emotion in every note, and it moved him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As the final note lingered in the air, the room remained hushed for a moment, as if no one dared to break the spell. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd, building into a full chorus of clapping and cheers. The guests who had once looked down on Tessa and Daniel were now on their feet, applauding with genuine admiration. Tessa sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys, trying to catch her breath. She hadn't played like that in years, and the overwhelming response left her speechless. Daniel was the first to reach her, his eyes wide with amazement. "Mom, that was incredible," he exclaimed, his voice full of pride. "I didn't know you could play like that." Tessa smiled softly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "I haven't played in a long time," she admitted, her voice shaky. "But tonight, I don't know, something just came over me." Ethan approached them, a look of awe still lingering on his face. "Tessa, that was beyond anything I could have expected," he said, his voice sincere. "You're not just talented, you're extraordinary. Why haven't you shared this gift with the world?" Tessa shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious again. "Life got in the way," she said quietly. "I had Daniel, and then there was work. I just didn't have time to pursue music the way I wanted to." Ethan shook his head, still in disbelief. "That's a shame," he said, "because you could have been a star." Tessa blushed, not used to such high praise. "I'm happy just playing for myself," she replied. "Music has always been my escape, something I do to feel connected to who I used to be, but I never thought it could be more than that." One of the guests, a man Tessa recognized as a renowned music producer, approached with an intrigued smile. "Tessa, I have to say that was one of the most moving performances I've heard in a long time," he said. "Have you ever considered playing professionally? I know plenty of artists who would love to collaborate with someone as talented as you." Tessa blinked, unsure of how to respond. Professional? Collaborations? These were words she had never imagined applying to herself. Her life had always been about getting by, making sure Daniel had what he needed, and working long hours to keep a roof over their heads. The idea of stepping into the spotlight, of having a career in music seemed almost impossible. I don't know, she stammered, feeling overwhelmed. I've never really thought about it. But before she could fully process what was happening, Ethan spoke up. You should think about it, Tessa, he said, his tone serious. You have something special. This isn't just a hobby. This is a gift, and the world deserves to hear it. Tessa felt a lump form in her throat. The thought of pursuing music, of stepping into a world so foreign to her now, was both exciting and terrifying. She had given up on her own dreams years ago, focusing instead on raising Daniel and surviving in a world that often felt like it was stacked against them. But now, hearing these people, these influential, powerful people, talk about her talent as something worthy of the world's attention, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more waiting for her than she had ever imagined. As she stood from the piano trying to compose herself, Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. Tessa, he said softly, I have an offer for you. Her heart skipped a beat. An offer? Ethan nodded. I don't just throw these parties for fun. I run a lot of high-profile events, and music is always a big part of them. I'd like to offer you a position, my lead pianist for all of my events moving forward. I'll pay you well, and it'll give you a chance to perform in front of some very important people. You'll get the exposure you deserve, and you won't have to worry about balancing it with your job as a security guard. Tessa's mind raced. Was this really happening? A job as a professional pianist? She had never dared to dream of something like this. It seemed too good to be true, but Ethan's sincerity was undeniable. This wasn't just a casual offer. He was giving her a real opportunity to change her life. I don't know what to say, Tessa whispered, her voice full of emotion. It's incredible. Ethan smiled warmly. Say yes, he said simply. Tessa glanced over at Daniel, who was watching her with wide eyes, clearly hoping she would take the offer. He had always believed in her, even when she had stopped believing in herself. And now, with this opportunity laid out in front of her, it felt like the universe was giving her a second chance. A chance to show Daniel that it was never too late to pursue your dreams. Taking a deep breath, Tessa turned back to Ethan, her heart pounding. Yes, she said, her voice steady. I'll do it. Ethan's smile widened. Excellent. We'll discuss the details later, but for now, just enjoy the rest of the night. You've earned it. As the party continued, Tessa felt a sense of relief and excitement she hadn't experienced in years. The overwhelming support from the guests, Ethan's generous offer, and the pride shining in Daniel's eyes made her realize that life had more in store for her than she had ever imagined. But the surprises weren't over yet. Later that evening, as the guests began to filter out and the night drew to a close, Ethan pulled Tessa aside once more. There's one more thing, he said, handing her a small envelope. Tessa frowned, confused. What's this? Open it, Ethan said, nodding toward the envelope. Tessa carefully tore it open and pulled out a letter. As she read it, her eyes widened in shock. It was a full scholarship for Daniel to attend one of the most prestigious music academies in the country. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at Ethan. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, overcome with emotion. You don't have to thank me, Ethan replied softly. Just keep doing what you're doing. You and Daniel have a bright future ahead of you. Tessa smiled through her tears, knowing that this night had changed their lives forever. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue inspiring stories like this one. We have many more powerful stories of resilience, family, and hope waiting for you. Click on the links on your screen to explore more heartwarming tales. Thank you for being part of our community, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.